I came to this book, I started it in 2008, and the reason I wrote this book was because of my personal and my professional background. So personally speaking, I am half Egyptian. My father and his family come from Egypt. Most of my family are in Egypt. I am Muslim. I speak Arabic. So I have an Arab heritage, but I grew up in Canada quite far from my Arab roots. And I never really thought much about that part of my life until September 11th. And really it was the events of that day that really impelled me to want to better understand where I came from, my Arab heritage. And when I was at The Economist, my responsibility was writing on global healthcare. And part of my job was covering the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And because of my connection to the Arab region, I became interested in what is happening around HIV in the Arab world. And as I started to look into HIV in the Arab region, it became very, very clear that the major stumbling block to really rising to the challenge of HIV were all the taboos around sex. And so I started looking at sexuality. It's the major source of transmission in most of our countries. And from that came Sex in the Citadel. The problem we have at the moment is that at any one time now across our region, we have vast swathes of the population which don't fit into the Citadel. So to give you just one example, the age of marriage has risen dramatically in many of our countries in the Arab region. And in Morocco, for example, the mean singular age of marriage for men is 32, and for women it's now 28. So we have this population which is unable to get inside the Citadel. They desperately want to get inside the Citadel. And yet they have no sort of socially accepted way to exercise what I would call their intimate rights, right, frankly. And then there are other populations as well that no longer fit into the Citadel of sexuality within marriage. And frankly, inside the Citadel, it's not all that great either. I mean, my book starts off with a very extensive chapter on what is happening in sexual life within marriage, and there are lots and lots of problems within it related to the taboos around sexuality. So that's the metaphor basically, and it really does explain this sort of the sexual landscape of the Arab region today. So the book is centered on Egypt, largely because of my personal background, as I mentioned. I mean, my connection to the Middle East is there. And I became interested in understanding sexuality because I would hear the stories of my father's youth. My father grew up in the 40s and 50s, and he came from a time which was, people just seemed to be so much more at ease in their sexual skin, quite frankly. But the other reason for focusing on Egypt is that Egypt is a real force in the Arab region. It is the most populous country. It has tremendous soft power. So it is the center of filmmaking. It is the center of TV production. So it is broadcasting its culture throughout the Arab region. Plus the fact that millions of Egyptians travel to particularly the Gulf states to work. So they are taking their customs with them, they are imbibing some of the customs of their host country, and then Egypt becomes a mix, basically. So it both absorbs, it's a bit like a sponge, but it also transmits as well. So changes in Egypt really matter because they can affect behaviors and attitudes elsewhere in the region. So you would think with all the taboos around sex that it would have been difficult to approach people on the subject. I mean, my problem was not getting people to talk about sex, it was getting them to stop talking about sex. Because of course people are talking about sex all the time. I mean, women are speaking with women in a very full and frontal fashion. You also find men speaking with men all the time. The problem happens when you bring men and women together, and then when you try to take this discourse into the public domain in terms of the media or in sex education in schools, which we don't have, or even in the religious discourse. So what makes sex respectable in the Arab region, what allows us to talk about it, is to problematize sex. So it is sex as a source of disease, HIV, it's a source of social disorder like sexual violence, for example. It's a source of exploitation, sexual trafficking. It's always sex as a problem to be solved rather than a pleasure to be celebrated. But just as Westerners have stereotypes about Eastern sexuality, people in the Arab region also have ideas about Western sexuality, and one of those ideas is that it's a big old free-for-all, basically, and anything goes. I cannot begin to tell you the number of taxis I've stepped into in Cairo in particular, where within about 5 minutes I am being asked, is it true that Western women usually have sex with more than one man at a time? I do have to explain to them that threesomes are not the norm. And also, I mean, you cannot believe the disappointment on these men's faces. It's interesting, I have a quote in the book. It's an Egyptian gynecologist who said to me, you know what, Shereen, in our part of the world, sex is the opposite of sport. Football, everybody talks about it, but hardly anyone plays it. But sex, everybody's doing it, and hardly anyone wants to talk about it. And the reality, of course, is that, as I said, they are talking in private. It's just taking this into the public domain. So I had the advantage of moving through different worlds, and as a result, I had endless conversations, and many of which found their way into Sex and the Citadel. It became very clear early on as I was doing the research that sexual freedom had a very particular connotation in the Arab region, and it was seen as something that was very negative. So it was seen as basically a Western construct of promiscuity. So it was the slippery slope to homosexuality, to prostitution, to pornography, and to basically a free love. Anyway, divorce, because marriage is the citadel, the place you want to be, the fortress, falling outside the citadel, i.e. through divorce, it can be very troubling for many women. And so this woman who had set up this support group for divorced women in Egypt, she told me about how she had got married. And she said, I had a whirlwind romance, it was a couple of months, and then we married. And I asked her, do you not think it might have been better if you had had a chance to get to know your husband? And by know, I meant also physically, have a sexual relationship. And she just looked at me and she said, you know what, Shereen, I'm not sure that freedom is necessarily a good thing. I'm not sure that it would have made my marriage any stronger. She said, just look at Madonna and her many husbands. She said, what we're really lacking is the ability to talk to our husbands, both inside the bedroom, in a sexual context, but outside as well. And what we're really longing for is, quite frankly, companionship and romance. We want romance. And she said, there seems to be more of that, more respect, more exchange, more equality in Western marriages than we see in our marriages. And then many of the single women I interviewed, again, what they were not looking for is the ability to have sex before marriage. What they really cared about was that their virginity, in particular, was their own business. That their hymen was their own business, and that it was not a source of family control or family concern. So there were elements that they thought were attractive in the Western world, but also elements that they simply could do without. Something we haven't talked about is, of course, that in another context, in the context of female virginity, which is a really big deal and really important in the Arab region. Again, it's how do we define virginity? Virginity is not defined by a state of chastity, the reality of it. It's defined by the appearance, which is an intact hymen. So anal sex, oral sex, outer course is increasingly common amongst young couples because it protects the almighty hymen. But very often, girls, young women who are engaging in anal sex, for example, will not use condoms because, as far as they're concerned, why would we ever do that? Because there's no chance of us getting pregnant, because of course we would never have vaginal intercourse because we want to get married and therefore we have to be virgins. But therein lies the rub, if you like, because their definition of virginity is just an intact hymen. When it comes to LGBTI, so I have a whole chapter in my book. That's one of the major groups that is outside the Citadel. And it's a tough time, definitely. If you look at most of our countries in the Arab region, we have laws which explicitly criminalize sodomy. Many countries have introduced laws recently, particularly in the Gulf states, which also criminalize essentially effeminate behavior or effeminate appearance. Notably, Kuwait has done this. Egypt has no explicit law which criminalizes sodomy or same-sex acts. And yet, over the last 1.5 to 2 years, we've seen close to 100 men who have sex with men and also transgendered individuals, mainly male to female, who have been arrested and subjected to torture in custody. Egypt is in a tricky position at the moment because the government is clamping down, as I mentioned, on LGBTI, just because it's trying to prove its Islamic street cred. At the same time, while it's persecuting the Muslim Brotherhood, it needs to show basically that it's holier than thou. And the easy target for that is these populations whom frankly no one is going to defend from inside the society. But if you look elsewhere, if you look at Morocco or Tunisia, I mean, it's interesting. You go out on the streets, and I mean, Tunisia, I'll give you an example. So both male and female homosexuality is criminalized in Tunisia. And yet, when you're out on the streets, you will find men. You find men in cafes. I mean, in Tunis, for example, you find men in cafes. And what's interesting is that although whether it's on the books or really in practice in terms of social opprobrium, it's male homosexuality that's really on the receiving end. It's very interesting, female homosexuality is simply not understood, really, in the Arab region today. Basically, people have a very sort of Clintonian definition of sex. If it doesn't involve a penis and penetration, then it's not really sex. So this is in the absence of a law. So there was a lot of stigma. There was a lot of family opprobrium and family despair and disdain. I mean, generally what happens if you are discovered to have same-sex inclination is if your family finds out, depending on which class you are, it's usually you're then whisked off to the priest or the imam and given a really stern talking to about hellfire and brimstone. If you're in a slightly different, more westernized class, you're often taken off to a psychiatrist. It's very interesting. Religious conversion is a matter of life and death in much of the Arab world. I mean, if you convert from Islam, it's a capital offense in Egypt, for example. And yet, sexual conversion people have no problems with. They think it's absolutely acceptable that you would try to turn someone from gay to straight. That being said, there is now a nascent movement, LGBTI movement, in many of our countries. So we now have close to 20 NGOs that are operating across the Arab region that are trying to find space for people who cross the sexual divide, the heteronormative divide. Many of these groups are quite small. I mean, some of them are only online. Many of them are just sort of informal support groups to give space for people to talk. But in some countries, in Lebanon, in Tunisia, for example, they have physical spaces, they organize challenges to the law, for example, they organize legal support for individuals who are arrested. They're quite active, not just online, but offline as well. In terms of the question of sexual assault, it's interesting that when I started this book in 2008, hardly any woman would speak openly about being sexually harassed, let alone sexually assaulted. And yet what has happened, as you referred to, we had these really quite dramatic cases of rape in Tahrir Square in the wake of the uprisings in 2011. Those sort of incredibly graphic and dramatic instances of sexual assault in Egypt have declined, largely because they were politically orchestrated. And when the politics changed, those cases stopped. But what you see is the drip, drip, drip of sexual harassment. So a survey in Egypt, which came out in 2013, done by UN Women, found that 99% of Egyptian women had reported having been harassed in the past 12 months. All that being said, we are seeing now a movement pushing back against sexual harassment in Egypt. And it's interesting, these are civil society groups. We have half a dozen now that are very active on the ground in Egypt. These are groups that are working against a very tough backdrop because the government has clamped down on civil society. It's very difficult to maneuver in this space. Nonetheless, they are active. And what's most interesting about these groups is that they're not just young women helping other women defend themselves, they're also bringing in young men. And that is a hugely important development, that you find men and women working together on this issue of sexual harassment. So the bottom line is that things are moving when it comes to sexual harassment and sexual violence, but we have a long way to go. And I'm talking in that context in terms of sexual violence in the public space. So sexual violence in the home is a completely different matter. One of the problems we have around this sort of domestic violence has to do with very conservative interpretations of Islam. So there are many individuals, religious scholars, who will say that it is a man's right to discipline his wife. Still in the Arab region, marital rape, for example, it's very, very hard to get a law which will criminalize that. Lebanon has been struggling for years to change the law, and yet there is a lot of resistance. Morocco, I think it was 2 years ago, closed a loophole in its law which allowed rapists off the hook if they married their victims. Yeah, this is not an uncommon. These laws have been changing slowly, but they're still on the books in a number of countries. It was very welcome that Morocco closed that loophole, and yet marital rape is still not criminalized. Essentially, polygamy is become quite rare now in most countries in the Arab region. And that is due to two factors. One is economic. Well, if you can't afford one wife, it's awfully difficult to have more than one. And so it's just for purely pragmatic economic reasons, it's become quite rare. Also because many countries in the Arab region are moving towards, particularly in a younger generation, are moving towards what I would call the companionate model of marriage. So if I go back to this youth survey in Egypt, it's very interesting. They ask young men, in particular, men, would you want to have more than one wife? And they say, no, I'm not interested. I'm just not interested in that, quite frankly. That being said, we do have a practice in Sunni Islam, also in Shia Islam, of so-called temporary marriages. So, Shia Islam has temporary marriages. We in Sunni Islam have informal marriages. So there are individuals I know who they are in marriages, but they're not official marriages. They're considered to be Islamically halal because they check all the boxes, but they're not actually registered with the state. So polygamy is taking a slightly different form, and the reason it goes to this informal is because you don't have the same financial obligations, and you're not held to them under the law. But again, it's not common. What I think is interesting is, I'm not sure if you're aware that in the pre-Islamic period, in what is now Western Saudi Arabia, there was the practice of polyandry, not polygamy. So women could have more than one husband, and in fact, if they conceived a child, they would choose which man they wanted to have as the father. And Islam turned that on its head. So it turned polyandry into polygamy. So again, Islam sets down rules and regulations around polygamy, and where it is practiced, and again, it's now rare. Again, you are enjoined to treat each wife equally, which is, as I said, very difficult in practice. The idea of a more than one partner in a sexual relationship is contrary to it's anathema, and it's actually haram. So there are quite strict regulations about one man, one woman, they have to be married. And that, interestingly, that definition of what constitutes a halal sexual act even crosses over into practices like intravenous, like IVF, in vitro fertilization, assisted reproduction techniques, where, for example, we cannot have, in Sunni Islam, you can't have gamete donation, so you can't have sperm or egg donation, because that is considered to be bringing a third party into the bed. Shia Islam is a bit different on this matter. They have a slightly different process of reasoning within Islam, and they come to slightly different conclusions. And they allow egg donation, but not sperm donation. So that's just an aside. But that's how those regulations actually play out in all sexual contexts. The most obvious way that economics intersects with sexuality is, of course, sex work. And I have a chapter in my book about female sex work, and it's a very interesting phenomenon because it is at one level the most visible face of sexuality in the Arab world. Because if you go anywhere, you will see female sex workers on the streets, in hotels, no matter where you go. And yet they're also the most hidden population. And certainly from an HIV outreach perspective, it's very difficult. For us working in this space. It's much easier to reach out to men who have sex with men, although, again, they are stigmatized and very often criminalized, than it is to reach out to women who are women who are sex workers, because the women are highly self-stigmatizing. And they suffer from a triple burden. They're women, who are having sex outside of marriage for money. And yet the sort of movements that you see in other parts of the global south, even here, I understand in South Africa, you have quite an active sex worker rights movement. I'd love to hear more about that. I mean, we just don't have that in the Arab region. These poor women, in many cases, are just are, as I said, both visible and hidden. And the vast majority of these women, in my experience, are basically women who are married, now divorced, have children to support. And you need to keep in mind that our unemployment rates are really high. So in Egypt, for example, 75% of women are not working. And this includes educated women as well. And so your options for getting a job as a man are pretty hard, and your options for getting a job as a woman are often harder. So these women are not doing it as a lifestyle choice. They're doing it because they don't have any other alternatives. And so that's really how the economics plays out. And they're in a very, very tough spot. But they're, unlike men who have sex with men, who are connected to the global movement in the global south of LGBT rights activism, even if they're not following the same script, they're at least sharing experiences and borrowing from each other. They know exactly what's going on in the transgender movement in Argentina, for example, or indeed about Section 377 in India and the recriminalization of same-sex acts. They're very, very networked, but female sex workers are not, or not yet, anyway. We have wealthy tourists who come from the Gulf states. And in the summer, they come shopping in Cairo, and one of the things they go shopping for are girls. And so they enter into these so-called summer marriages, in which these girls are effectively being trafficked by their families. They enter into these temporary marriages. They last a couple of weeks or months, and then the marriage dissolves because divorce is easy, and then the girls go back to their families. And it's a very difficult type of it's a difficult practice to get a handle on because, of course, it has the veneer of marriage. So basically, this is part of the gap between appearance and reality in our societies. We have what is effectively sex trafficking, sex tourism, and sex work masquerading as marriage. The issue in Islam is there is a real issue about it's a tension, because on the one hand we need to find a way to talk about these issues. We have all these sexual hang-ups. We need to talk about them because the consequences of silence are becoming quite serious in terms of the rising HIV rates, the rising rates of sexual violence. On the other hand, it is not our tradition to talk very openly about these things, because within an Islamic context there is also a principle to also conceal our sins. So it's a very delicate balancing act. How do we both walk that line yet also are more open on these issues as well? And so what people are often looking for, as I said, is just the ability to do these, to access the information, to express their ideas, to express their sexuality, but in private, basically. They're not looking to parade it in public. And that's why many people will say, the West is just not a model for us, because it comes from a very different political, economic, cultural, and social history, which is not necessarily relevant to us. We have to find our own way. But the problem is that we need to have our own, we can't just say no. Just saying no is not getting us anywhere. It's not solving our problems. We need to really construct our own positive model of what sexual openness and sexual fulfillment would look for us in our context. And that's the struggle that we're facing now, many of us who are working in this space in the
But I would just like to say thank you so much, Shereen, for that seminar. That was fascinating, and it's so wonderful to just host you and hear about your very important research.
Thank you very much. Well, and it was great. It was great to have an opportunity to come here and to meet with the Institute and to meet with all of you. And I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great, and thank you all for coming.